So I'm trying out a new reading position in the house, and also I'm trying out a new Shure microphone for my iPhone. And so I hope that the sound is good and that the image is good for you. Today I'm reading from Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. I'm reading from Chapter 5, Christ, a Symbol of the Self. In this video, I'll be reading paragraphs 78 to 80. Paragraph 78. In making these statements, we are keeping entirely within the sphere of Christian psychology and symbolism. A factor that no one has reckoned with, however, is the fatality inherent in the Christian disposition itself, which leads inevitably to a reversal of its spirit, not in the obscure workings of chance, but in accordance with psychological law. The ideal spirituality striving for the heights was doomed to clash with the materialistic, earthbound passion to conquer matter and master the world. This change became visible at the time of the Renaissance. The word means rebirth, and it referred to the renewal of the antique spirit. We know today that this spirit was chiefly a mask. It was not the spirit of antiquity that was reborn, but the spirit of medieval Christianity that underwent strange pagan transformations, exchanging the heavenly goal for an earthly one, and the vertical of the Gothic style for a horizontal perspective, voyages of discovery, exploration of the world and of nature. The subsequent developments that led to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution have produced a worldwide situation today which can only be called anti-Christian in a sense that confirms the early Christian anticipation of the end of time. It is as if, with the coming of Christ, opposites that were latent till then had become manifest, or as if a pendulum had swung violently to one side and were now carrying out the complementary movement in the opposite direction. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The double meaning of this movement lies in the nature of the pendulum. Christ is without spot, but right at the beginning of his career, there occurs the encounter with Satan, the AntiChrist, who represents the counterpole of that tremendous tension in the world psyche which Christ's advent signified. He is the mysterium iniquitatis that accompanies the soul iustitiae as inseparably as the shadow belongs to the light in exactly the same way. So the Ebionics and Euchites thought that one brother cleaves to the other. Both strive for a kingdom, one for the kingdom of heaven, the other for the principatus huius mundi. We hear of a reign of 1,000 years and of a coming of the AntiChrist, just as if a partition of worlds and epochs had taken place between two royal brothers. The meeting with Satan was therefore more than mere chance. It was a link in the chain. Paragraph 79. Just as we have to remember the gods of antiquity in order to appreciate the psychological value of the anima-animus archetype, so Christ is our nearest analogy of the self and its meaning. It is naturally not a question of a collective value artificially manufactured or arbitrarily awarded, but of one that is effective and present per se, and that makes its effectiveness felt, whether the subject is conscious of it or not. Yet although the attributes of Christ, consubstantiality with the Father, co-eternity, filiation, parthenogenesis, crucifixion, lamb sacrifice between opposites, one divided into many, etc., undoubtedly mark him out as an embodiment of the self, looked at from the psychological angle, he corresponds to only one half of the archetype. The other half appears in the AntiChrist. The latter is just as much a manifestation of the self, except that he consists of its dark aspect. Both are Christian symbols, and they have the same meaning as the image of the Savior crucified between two thieves. This great symbol tells us that the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness leads to an ever more menacing awareness of the conflict and involves nothing less than the crucifixion of the ego. Its agonizing suspension between irreconcilable opposites. Naturally, there can be no question of a total extinction of the ego, for then the focus of consciousness would be destroyed, and the result would be complete unconsciousness. The relative abolition of the ego affects only those supreme and ultimate decisions which confront us in situations where there are insoluble conflicts of interest. This means, in other words, that in such cases the ego is a suffering bystander who decides nothing but must submit to a decision and surrender unconditionally. The genius of man, the higher and more spacious part of him whose extent no one knows, has the final word. Dr. Jung has put the word genius in quotation marks, so let me read this sentence once again. The genius of man, the higher and more spacious part of him whose extent no one knows, has the final word. It is therefore well to examine carefully the psychological aspects of the individuation process in the light of Christian tradition, which can describe it for us with an exactness and impressiveness far surpassing our feeble attempts, even though the Christian image of the self, Christ, lacks the shadow which properly belongs to it. There's a long footnote here from Origen, Contra Celsum, Volume 6, page 45. But it is fitting that one of these two extremes, and that the best, should be called the Son of God, because of his excellence, and the other, diametrically opposed to him, the son of the evil demon, of Satan and the devil. Origen goes on, the opposites even condition one another. Where there is evil, there must needs be good contrary to the evil. The one follows from the other. Hence we must do away with both and deny that good and evil exist, or if we admit the one, and particularly evil, we must also admit the good. In contrast to this clear logical statement, Origen cannot help asserting elsewhere that the powers, thrones, and principalities down to the evil spirits and impure demons do not have it, the contrary virtue, substantiality, and that they were not created evil, but chose the condition of wickedness. And that they were not created evil, but chose the condition of wickedness of their own free will. Origen is already committed, at least by implication, to the definition of God as the Summum Bonum, and hence betrays the inclination to deprive evil of substance. He comes very close to the Augustinian conception of the privatio boni when he says, for it is certain that to be evil means to be deprived of good. But this sentence is immediately preceded by the following. To turn aside from good is nothing other than to be perfected in evil. This shows clearly that an increase in the one means a diminution of the other, so that good and evil represent equivalent halves of an opposition. Paragraph 80. The reason for this, as already indicated, is the doctrine of the Summum Bonum. Irenaeus says very rightly, in refuting the Gnostics, that exception must be taken to the light of their Father, because it could not illuminate and fill even those things which were within it, namely the shadow and the void. It seemed to him scandalous and reprehensible to suppose that within the pleroma of light there could be a dark and formless void. For the Christian, neither God nor Christ could be a paradox. They had to have a single meaning, and this holds true to the present day. No one knew, and apparently with a few commendable exceptions, no one knows even now, that the hybris of the speculative intellect had already emboldened the ancients to propound a philosophical definition of God that more or less obliged him to be the summum bonum. A Protestant theologian has even had the temerity to assert that God can only be good. Yahweh could certainly have taught him a thing or two in this respect, if he himself is unable to see his intellectual trespass against God's freedom and omnipotence. This forcible usurpation of the summum bonum naturally has its reasons, the origins of which lie far back in the past, though I cannot enter into this here. Nevertheless, it is the effective source of the concept of privatio boni, which nullifies the reality of evil and can be found as early as Basil the Great, 330 to 379, and Dionysius the Areopagite, second half of the 4th century, and is fully developed in Augustine.